Hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing well today. And we're so excited to have you joining us for our webinar, Local Strategies and Global Reach, Best Practices in Conducting Remote International UX Research. My name is Lynette, and I'm part of the team here at AnswerLab. And before we start, I just want to run through a couple of quick housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and everyone will receive a recording via email afterward. So if for any reason you're disconnected or we experience technical issues, no worries. We'll make sure you still receive this content via email. If you have any questions you'd like to submit, you can do so via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer them at the end of the discussion. We're going to do our best to keep this to 45 minutes so you can stay on track for the rest of your day. Next slide, please. Now, for those of you who haven't heard of AnswerLab, we are a full-service user experience research firm that specializes in enterprise research services to deliver user insight across every stage of product development. Our mission is to help create experiences that people love. We've got a great panel set up for you today, so I'll hand over the mic to our speakers so they may introduce themselves before we jump into the conversation.
Hey, thank you, Lynette. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. This is Joe Galenick. I'm the e-commerce strategy manager here at AnswerLab, and I'm really thrilled to be participating and moderating on this webinar today with two of my trusted and valued colleagues, Allison Small and Sonam Gill. Before we get started, I just want to have a brief introduction to myself. I've been the e-commerce strategy manager for AnswerLab now for about a year. Been with AnswerLab now for about 3 years, previously a senior researcher. I have over 15 years of consulting experience in a number of verticals across state, local governments, federal government, health, business, criminal justice, you name it. I have consulted with somebody at some level within all of those domains. I'm a PhD anthropologist by training, so I'm particularly excited about this focus today on international work and the importance of cultural considerations as we engage research in markets outside of the US. And I'll let Sonam introduce herself. Welcome, Sonam.
Hey, y'all. My name is Sonam, and I'm a research manager here at AnswerLab, where I'm providing basically strategic research oversight on a variety of projects and programs. Basically, I'm just there to ensure that research is being constructed and conducted with the goals in mind and has resounding impact. I have a decade of experience in research coming from a psychology background, and I've worked in both the hardware and digital spaces with specific focuses on all things TV, as well as social media. My specialties have also included DEI, teen accessibility, and of course, international research. I'll pass it to Allison to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Small, and I'm a research operations manager at AnswerLab. I have 20 years of research experience in various roles and industries, and my specialty areas are international, healthcare, and accessibility research. Thanks for joining us today.
Fantastic. Thank you, team. Let's get right into it. Sonam's going to lead us now into really understanding what is the value of conducting international research and really how do we pull it off. Sonam, what do you have for us today?
Yeah, so I think we're all attuned to the fact that we should test all of our products and services in different markets. Well, why? I'll give you a domestic example to start. Let's say you had a product that was utilized across the country, but you were only testing it in San Francisco. Well, your findings would almost certainly lean in the direction of what tech-savvy iOS users are doing, and that wouldn't really end up being representative of your entire population. Because in fact, almost 50% of users across the US are Android users. And if we went further and extended that thought internationally, there's actually more Android users than there are iOS in the world. So there would actually be so many untapped behaviors and perspectives that you would be losing out on if you just kept your research to San Francisco, which would ultimately lead to a bad product for a significant portion of your user base. But as you can imagine, that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the multitudes of nuances that are present across peoples and communities. I think we know like every country is subject to entirely different sets of societal, environmental, governmental, and cultural norms, and that we should work to capture those if we really want to understand the context of whatever we've unleashed into the world. But you know, sometimes our biggest hurdle when it comes to international research isn't understanding that we should do it, but how do we pull it off? What are the things we need to consider from cultural and logistical perspectives that ensure the research is representative and meaningful? I would sort of say, like, while running remote research comes with its own obstacles, it actually unlocks our ability to run international research more frequently and effectively. And we're really excited to explore that with you today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sonam. Before we get started into diving into some of these logistics, I really want to engage with our participants today to think through what is culture, right? Particularly for those of, for folks in the US who want to engage in research. Sometimes, our country's so large, sometimes we think that this is the only culture there may be, or everybody else has culture except for us, right? But that's obviously the wrong way to think about culture. So I can put on my anthropology hat right now and just kind of share a little bit from like an anthropology 101 course to really think through this. And I would tell our participants today, match up your understanding of culture and see if this models on to how you think about not only other people's culture, but your own. This definition should apply to any individual or community that you engage with. So culture is community's learned and shared framework for understanding the world. It enables people to make decisions, successfully adapt to their world, both materially and psychologically, and solve their pressing problems, such as what should I do for a living, who should I marry, and where should I live? Those are just a few examples. Culture changes over time, so I don't really like this idea of a laundry list of cultural items because culture is constantly changing. If you talk to anybody 20 years younger than you that lives on the other side of the country, you'll experience that quite rapidly. And cultural norms and values display diversity in the complex societies. There are subcultural groups that may not have the same cultural background as the dominant majority group within the markets that you wish to research. These are just some important considerations to take into account as you begin to engage with people outside of your own culture, particularly for research. So culture is communicated through symbols. What does that mean exactly? Without getting too academic, let me just show you a couple of photos these will resonate with you, I'm sure. So culture is communicated through symbols. A little photo from my recent trip to New Mexico, some Day of the Dead art that we saw out in the marketplace. These have very specific cultural meanings of the relationships with families and also the deceased. Everybody looking at these should automatically have ideas pop into your mind in addition to slogans or last time you had a caramel macchiato. And then finally, symbols also can be contested, even though they're present and embraced by people, and different interpretations can be placed on symbols. But the most important thing that I want to emphasize here is that culture is transmitted through language. And the best way to access someone's culture is through language, which Sonam will be addressing later when we talk about the importance of local moderators. I just want to give you a few examples of some business questions that I fielded from our partners over the last year to really have you folks think out loud and think for your organization, your group, or maybe your own research or study. People may not use products in the same way as in the US because of their cultural and societal and social context. As an example, do all people in Portugal want to shop for their goods online? What if there's a marketplace closer to the house and they can walk there? That's a very different experience from the suburbs in America. Do strong family and community ties in Greece decrease the use of social media? If my extended cousins and family live in the same community as me and I can see them anytime I want to, why do I need to look at pictures of them on my phone? These are some business questions that we've received that we really tried to address for our partners. What is considered personal information across cultures? May not want to ask people about their health status or their telephone numbers, depending on the cultural context in which they're in. And that really what relates to Allison's experience in terms of creating screeners and appropriate recruitment. These are just some of the things that we should look at and not assume are the same across cultures. I know it seems like a no-brainer, but it's really something to consider when you're engaging in this kind of work. Now, if you're really interested to dig into this further, Jiro, a fantastic colleague of mine that is an international research manager, has written this recent article, 6 Cultural Considerations when Conducting International UX Research. And she provides a deeper dive into some of the highlights and bullet points that I just shared with you. This is fully downloadable on our website, and Lynette, I'm assuming we'll send that out to everybody at the end of the webinar, so they'll have access to this in addition to some other content. So, all right, well, thank you for everybody for letting me put on my anthropologist hat for a minute. And I want to get into now with Sonam, thinking about the complexity that we've kind of established already. What are some of the common challenges and considerations that we see? Let me get into this for everybody, because I guess I'm going to start us off actually. Let's take a look first of all at the level of understanding of the products and service usage. and the competitive landscape in selected markets. Often our partners may not fully understand the incidence rate for the use of particular products, particularly competitor products. And we've seen it that there can be some assumptions going into other markets, like, of course, everybody uses this, right? Like, who told you that? Because we're not sure. Just because a product has a very fancy website doesn't mean that everybody's using it across that market that you're interested in. Nothing against fancy websites. We love those. And then also there could be a cost measure here that might take people by surprise because of the complexity of studies and the engagement of local teams, which we'll be describing in detail later about why you would need a local team and why that investment is absolutely necessary to successfully execute this type of complex research. So from a scoping perspective, those are the two things that I see. We'll get into those a little more later, but let me just pass this over to Allison. She'll talk a little bit from a research operations perspective.
Thanks, Joe. So feasibility of recruit and study logistics in terms of understanding the incidence rate of the target audience in the selected market and how participants use the product or service that you're testing. So one or both may be unknown until recruitment is underway. Also identifying what considerations should be made regarding scheduling, technology, and session setup in the selected markets. For example, when are the participants available for sessions? Are we conducting research in an Android or iOS heavy market, as we talked about earlier? And what devices and conferencing platforms should participants use during the sessions? Also, in-market recruiting and fielding partner expertise. It's key to work with vetted and experienced recruiting and fielding partners in each market. And local partners, and especially the ones that we partner with, should be collaborative and really act as thinking partners during all the project phases.
Absolutely. But sorry, I just totally interrupted you. So what else do we have to say about this timeline today that's really critical for our participants to understand today?
Yeah, well, I can't say the amount of times that I've delivered a timeline and everyone's like, why is it so long? Well, with all the complexity that comes with international research, we really need to be cognizant of building a timeline that accounts for that. So whether that's adding time for recruit, translations, pilot sessions, aligning with the local moderator, or even time to pivot when the unexpected happens, I can definitely say with absolute certainty that you'll be grateful for those extra days of room you give yourself.
Absolutely. So now I want to get into a little more detail about what we just reviewed with Allison and Sonam. So let's dig into this a little more. I want to go a little bit more into the scoping considerations. So as an example, again, just to really emphasize this for our participants today, if you yourself want to do the research, or if you're going to reach out to an agency, ours ideally, that a client's conducted, if you want to do this research in a select market, do you really know what's going on there? And how do you know what's going on there, right? That's really important. Have you done research previously in here? And could that actually support your initiatives for this current study? What is the competitive landscape? How are products used in other markets? Do we need to conduct desk research or secondary research to really have an understanding of your competitors and whether the product that you're looking to launch in another market will be accepted? Or maybe another product has got such a tight lock on that particular market that it may be extraordinarily challenging for you. So these are things that you really need to know. And this goes back to what we mentioned earlier about the complexity of international research, in addition to kind of dismissing and eliminating your assumptions about how things work in other parts of the world, just because they seem very much like us, but they may not be, whoever it is that are living in this market that you wanted to conduct research with. The other consideration is, does stakeholders or the team members have partners in these particular markets, and what are their expectations throughout each phase of the research? I worked with a research team in Madrid last year to scope some work for them. I felt very comfortable talking to them about the landscape in Spain and understanding a little bit about the market, because they were marketers in Spain. So their data was pretty solid, and they felt very comfortable in identifying parts of their markets that had very low penetration in the EU as compared to ones that were very high. And do we have trusted strategic thinking partners that are able to field and recruit for these studies? Allison touched on this just a moment ago. Or do we need to vet and completely new partner. Maybe for the UK, that might be pretty easy, but what if you wanted to get into Poland or Japan? How would that actually work? And that partner must have knowledge about cultural nuances, the language, which we'll be emphasizing later, and something that someone will share with us, the technological environment, incidence rates of the customer behaviors that you might be aiming to understand, fielding logistics and cultural considerations for privacy, and also local governmental ordinances for data compliance. Sounds pretty simple to scope, right? But all of these things have to be taken into consideration with scoping. Now, I'm going to turn this over to Allison now. She's going to talk a little bit more about these timelines that are so shocking to people when they actually see them sent over email. So let's take a look here at what Allison's got to say.
So why are international research timelines longer than domestic timelines? Well, there are many reasons, but I'd like to start walking you through some of the milestones that we incorporate into these timelines that just are necessary just for the overall success of the project. Next slide, please. So to begin with, we have collaboration within market partners. So it takes additional time to set up projects, prepare the schedules and recruitment materials, and also to collaborate across different time zones. And during the planning phase, we really rely on our partners to help navigate regulations such as GDPR and to really better understand how cultural nuances impact the research. And we build this collaboration into our timelines. Finally, it's essential to schedule time to onboard and train the entire delivery team at your partners on your research processes and expectations in order to minimize surprises along the way. There's definitely a lot of things that come up with international research, and we want to be nimble to be able to make sure that we are on track to field and deliver the insights to our clients. In terms of translation of materials, this milestone allows time for translations of recruitment materials, as well as research plans and stimuli and participant instructions. What are they going to have to do to prepare for their session? What will they need to do during their session? And if there are additional activities, for example, homework assignments or remote diaries, those materials also have to be translated in advance of fielding and post-fielding if applicable. Finally, all translated materials should be quality checked to ensure the appropriate context, syntax, and tone in order to meet the study objectives. Moderator and translating vetting and onboarding, we allow time to vet experienced moderators and simultaneous translators for our studies. And we want to have a team who's not only fully understands the research objectives, but also has the appropriate moderation and communication style for our study. Each client has their preferences, and we want to be able to vet and secure a team that is going to meet the study needs. Once that team is selected, we want to allow time to onboard the team and ensure they demonstrate a high level of English proficiency so they can effectively communicate with you and your team, and also demonstrate an openness to flex. And again, I mentioned this before, and just be nimble to meet the client's needs. The final piece in our prep and recruitment milestone is additional recruitment time. And this is really important to build in time to be able to course correct and adapt if the actual incidence rate differs from what we scoped or predicted, or if you encounter low show rates or a high number of cancellations during fielding. Again, sometimes we don't know what's going to happen in the market if we're recruiting a target that the client hasn't done a lot of research with. We want to allow time to make some changes. And sometimes teams have to engage additional partners to fill challenging to recruit sessions. So the extra recruit time minimizes the likelihood of us having to move or cancel research session dates.
That's great, Allison. Thank you. And again, from a scoping perspective, I'd also like to add here that we're not talking about tacking 2 weeks back onto the timeline for this, right? We're looking at a day or two, Allison, really to make sure we have some buffer. Is that an accurate understanding?
Exactly. I mean, just given, for example, when we're scoping and we're bidding with our partners, and In a domestic market, we usually allow 24 hours. And then for international markets, we just double that to 48. So these are not huge timeline extensions, but they just allow us to have a little more time to have that communication back and forth and confirm things before we move forward.
Yeah, in the long run, you'll be thankful with that extra day if things start to become challenging. So no one's going to complain about that 48 hours. Sonam, can you guide us through the rest of this timeline and give us some insight into these last two bullets?
Yeah, so since you'll be working with a local moderator, and this is something we absolutely recommend that I'll talk to you more later, you'll need time to onboard them to the research and really help them understand what you're trying to achieve. And then you'll also want to make sure that they have a chance to take that information and the discussion guide for a spin with a pilot session. And so where the extra days kind of get added is to have those alignment meetings, and also because you don't want to run a pilot session back to back with your sessions, because there's a really good chance you're going to need revisions, as most of us do when we run our first session. And then you'll have to account for translation, edits, and debrief meetings to get everything to that finalized place that you really need. Throw in the different time zones on top of that. You'll remember why I mentioned the extra days are absolutely necessary. And then lastly, I would recommend a little bit of added time at the back end, just because you might need additional time to follow up with the local moderator to ask questions that might come up as you analyze the data, or to confirm what you're observing to make sure that you're getting it right. So I actually had this one study where we were given specific recruit criteria that ended up having a really low incidence rate in that country. And then once we managed to conduct the research, the findings were a little unusual compared to the other markets that we were testing. What actually ended up happening is we had to do a little bit of desk research to put the findings in context. And that's when we found out that there were actually governmental regulations that were affecting the usage of the platform in that specific country. And honestly, that was a finding in and of itself. So it's important to have that extra time, because sometimes you will need to do a little extra digging when you're trying to understand something that you honestly don't have full awareness of. But yeah, that actually, I think, brings us to our next question.
Yeah, and I'd also add to Sonam's comments here, it also depends on the complexity of the product that you may be testing. As an example, if you're doing usability testing or anything like that, the more complex a product is, particularly in, like, as an example, financial services or e-commerce products, those are very, very complicated. Notice I use two varies there. And so those can be particularly challenging to field across markets where, again, as I pointed out earlier, people may not use them, or they may use them differently, or they may have a different perspective on those products, specifically because of their cultural and social context. So we've been talking a lot, team, about working with local moderators and the importance of this. And, why is this so important? I mean, we've kind of, give people a preview a little bit, talking about language, building in this stuff with the timelines. But Son, can you give us, like, really, why do we do this? Why do we add all this extra steps and effort into this for international research?
Yeah, because there are a number of reasons, and I'll kind of start at the top, but local moderators have the cultural context that you might not. And so due to that, they might understand the why of what's happening, or they might be able to better flag market differences that you just wouldn't be able to see. Another example is we were working on a project with a financial platform a while back, and we were testing it in Japan. And we made a direct translation of the discussion guide and the prototype. But once it was reviewed by the local moderator, we found out that it didn't make sense to have a denomination of 1 Japanese yen. So we had translated it from 1 USD. That's how we got the 1 Japanese yen. But come to find out that 1 Japanese yen is an absolutely meaningless amount, like it's less than a penny. So you can see why it's important to work with someone who can see it from the lens that it's going to be perceived. And I know the next question might also be like, but what if we can recruit for participants in English? Like, why can't we conduct a study ourselves in that country, right? But the thing is, like, and I've seen this happen on multiple occurrences, is that participants might be comfortable saying something in their local language, and they could switch back and forth during the session, or they just realize, like, there's some things that just can't be said in English that they can say, like, in the language that they have, or they might use terminology that we're less familiar with here in the US. So it's really important to have someone who can navigate and interpret that. We've also had incidences where participants self-report their mastery of English as fluent, but it just doesn't quite align with what might be fluent enough for us to lead that conversation. And then lastly, I also kind of want to dive into the second half of this question about, like, how to set them up for success. In many cases, the local moderator might not be a UX researcher. They're just a moderator. So setting them up with success means like providing them with any foundational research you might have and a solid discussion guide. I think one of the things, for example, is like you might not think of doing this for yourself, is writing out all the probes, but that would be vital for you to do with a local moderator because they might not recognize the possible tangents the conversation could take naturally and where you're expecting the focus. Additionally, like alignment meetings that I mentioned before prior to sessions are really important. So you can discuss the impact of the research, right? Because they don't know anything about that. Like this is their first kind of exploration into it. So what I actually like to do is I like to set the moderator up with the top 5 questions I need an answer to from the research, basically like the core of what we're after, so that they can understand the bigger picture, like what I'm trying to draw out from the multitude of discussion guide questions I've written. So that way they're not just like jumping down the rabbit holes without guardrails, because let's be honest, sometimes we could go like anywhere with the open-ended questions that we've asked. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, pilot sessions and debriefs are absolutely critical. So you can like fill in the gaps of what the moderator might not see. And they also have an opportunity to ask you questions about something they might not fully understand or didn't expect. Because sometimes those questions or thoughts only pop up after seeing the guide in action. And I think we can actually all agree that sometimes the answer to a question can really surprise us. And we're like, oh, didn't realize it was going to go that direction. Kind of have to pivot now. So yeah, that's kind of like why, again, I think the ultimate recommendation is having someone who really can understand the cultural context, but there's a lot of work from our end as well to set them up so that they can navigate the conversation in the way that you've envisioned.
Thanks, Sonam. And maybe I missed this, but do we often in those pilot sessions, do we prep the local moderators in terms of the prototypes and particular products or anything like that as well, besides just the moderator guide?
Yep. So great question, Joe, because in those, that's pretty much what we're doing in those alignment meetings beforehand. Some of the things is like we go over the moderator guide from top to bottom. We discuss the prototypes. We're actually sometimes looking at it in English and in the local language, or at least giving the moderator enough time to do both, because then they can kind of understand like, okay, this is what you were after. This is what it actually says in this local language. And sometimes we've been able to identify, like, as I mentioned in the Japanese yen example, like, oh, that doesn't actually like align. Like, I know what you're trying to get at. That's not how we would say it here. Or like, this language is too formal. Maybe we can make it informal. So then it's also nice to have time after the pilot sessions or like in between, so that your moderator can actually like kind of help you like tweak the language a little bit so that it flows a little bit more naturally when they're talking to the participants.
That's great. And I've seen also in scoping as well for folks who are cost conscious on our call today, the idea that these prototypes, that costs an investment to have those translated if you're going to do multiple markets. So another thing for folks to consider is if you do have some type of product and prototype that you're going to be testing, take that also, we talked about translations earlier, but take that into consideration as well. Does your team internally have the resources to translate all the nuances of a prototype? Or if you're looking at it, I think Sonam, you and I ran into this on a project earlier this year. If you're looking at a financial product that is used, say, for instance, in China, the team really does need to let us know, they did, but also just, you need to think about it too. What information is important off the screen if it may be in a language other than English? So we're not just talking about translations of moderator guides or the translations of research objectives or even the translations of the product that you may be testing, but it's also important to say, if you're going to, like, as an example, do that research that we recommended you to do earlier and really understand that market that you want to conduct research in. Do you have the capacity to actually translate what those people in those markets would be viewing on your competitors' sites or products? That's really tricky. So you really need to think through that. And so as as Sonam mentioned, we still want to do these with local moderators. And of course, in order to get that language nuance, we really need that. But it's also important to consider that those language barriers could even still exist at those very small stages within a research session. So I want to move on and talk about, because we promised everyone that we were going to talk about the unexpected Not that any of us have ever experienced the unexpected on a study like this, but there's always a chance that something could, I'm not going to say wrong, I'm going to say something challenging can occur. A recruit takes longer than expected. We get into the field and all of a sudden a partner may say, hey, can we get all that translated on the screen that they're looking at? So there's a lot of detail here that can actually generate challenges, regardless of the amount of planning that you do. And Sonam, can you share with us anything that you've experienced and how we successfully pivoted in the field when these challenges arise? And I'd reach out to Allison as well if she wants to chime in too. I think we're doing great on time.
Yeah, well, if there's one thing I can say, international research keeps me on my toes. I'll leave it at that. But piggybacking on something that I was saying earlier, sometimes the local moderator might be skilled as a moderator, but you might be exposing them to an area that they don't have any expertise in. So we had a project where once we saw the pilot, we realized that even though the moderator was skilled, they didn't have the skills that were applicable to that study. So basically they had no experience using the platform, and that foundational understanding was actually really critical because the tangents they were following were about things that like fundamentally we could not change about the platform. So what we ended up having to do is we pivoted to a new moderator. And what we actually did is we added do not ask questions to the discussion guide to better showcase like those guardrails of this is a conversation that we're after. This is the capabilities of the platform, kind of like, okay, this is the direction we want to go in. This is the direction we like can't go in. So that study actually is one of the reasons why one of our recommendations is not to have pilots back to back with sessions. So you can give yourselves a few days to pivot as needed. Ever since then, we always have a few days built in. But it also speaks to the ways in which you can write a clear discussion guide that ensures alignment with your research goals, especially if your sessions are in a time zone where you can't always watch live. So you got to kind of put a little bit more work or effort in at the front end to ensure that like things can kind of go off if you can't be around.
That's really helpful. The other thing I'd add here too is also this does get a little bit back into the researching the market that you want to conduct the research in. I was on a project a couple of years ago, and one of the value propositions of the product is that it was free. In America, so a lot of times people are saying nothing's free, right? Because of our suspiciousness or our skepticism about free products. And we didn't find that uniformly over in the EU markets that we were interviewing in, which I found to be very interesting. And that took a lot of discussion and a lot of revision of the moderator guide to figure out how to ask that question appropriately without people just saying, yeah, it's free, great. Right? Because the amount of skepticism that we anticipated in that research was not present in the EU markets. So again, that was like generative research. So again, with the importance of understanding people's cultural context and also the language, what does free mean if you're interviewing people in Italy? What does that mean exactly as compared to Ohio? Right. So those type of cultural considerations also can make you pivot. And as Sonam pointed out about pilots, if you do that and the local moderator catches something like, hey, free does not mean free when we talk about products, you really have to engage with a lot of this planning and pivoting, piloting prior to launching into the study to make sure that you're on target with what you're asking and working with a local team.
Yeah. And something I brought up earlier was we do a lot of collaborating with our partners, but we also do a lot of collaborating and consulting with our clients as well. So if, in terms of pivoting, and again, when we go into some markets and we don't know the incidence rate or things unfold a little bit differently when recruitment is underway, we do often have to pivot on recruitment criteria. And those are things that we actually had those discussions up front with our clients. And it sort of has to be an ongoing discussion about what areas can we flex on and what are not negotiable, whether it be in utilization or it's in demographics. Those are the discussions that we continually have with not only with our partners in market, but we have them with our clients too, to make sure that we have the appropriate participants for the research. Like, you're not going to garner the right insights and the appropriate insights for your study unless you have the right person sitting on the other side of your screen. So we often pivot and we flex on recruitment criteria, and in the end, we still get and meet the study objectives because we have had those ongoing discussions throughout the entire study. So whether it begins in the prep and it goes all the way into fielding, and sometimes we're pivoting during fielding and, swapping in alt or a floater sometimes, which are the over recruits for a main participant who might just be a better fit or to fill in a gap of maybe something we didn't cover in a previous session.
That's a critical piece Allison's identified here, everyone, is that it doesn't matter if you got the moderator guide all planned out, the questions are tight, the prototype's translated, everything's set up. If you're talking to the wrong people, then it's kind of a waste of effort. And it's really important to ensure that the people you're talking to are the target audience for your product or people that you hope will use your product. Sonam, with Allison's story here, does research have to pivot much once any kind of flex criteria comes into play in international research? What does research have to take into consideration?
I think our biggest thing with recruit criteria in international markets is I think that, okay, for example, when you have domestic recruit criteria, it's a little bit easier to understand because you're from the market. You kind of understand how everything is segmented or maybe why it was even segmented that way, right? But when you go with international recruit criteria, it's a step further. It's here's an entirely different market that I really don't have any insight to. I'm also kind of debriefing with the client to understand why is this perspective here? But I think for us, what ends up happening that we're pivoting a little bit is there ends up being more background research happening at the front end, because it's okay, I should have kind of a baseline understanding of the participants that I'm trying to talk to. So again, it comes down to when you have those tangents and those probes in sessions, well, we can't expect, but at least we can kind of expect what kind of pathways are we unlocking and why are they meaningful?
That's fantastic. All right, so we're coming up on time here, everyone, but I do believe that we have some time for questions. So let me take a look at this one here that we got in, and I feel like I'm on a game show. Allison, I'm gonna direct this question to you. Please form your answer in the form of a question. No, we're not going to do that. Allison, let's get into this question seriously. Often each local team will have their own ways of working and conducting research. So how do we come together and build a standard process that makes collaborative work easy across global teams?
That's a great question. And it's one that goes back to vetting experienced strategic thinking partners and also incorporating the appropriate international milestones into all project timelines. So at AnswerLab, we work with a team of trusted partners who are pretty much part and parcel to our international research. So all have been fully trained on how we do research at AnswerLab, how our timelines work, and the types of communication and deliverables that we expect to receive during a study. And even at the end of studies, or we debrief with our partners in the market, and we also schedule periodic check-ins with our partners to ensure that we're aligned and that we understand that we're aligned on the market dynamics, I would say, that drive feasibility, cost, regulations, and just the overall success of the project in each market.
Thanks, Allison. You've used that term vetted a few times today, and I think we all know what that means, but I hate to ask people to rank things, but I'm going to ask you to rank. What is the number one thing you think is most important when you're vetting a partner?
I think with international research, it's being a strategic thinking partner. It's not just taking our screeners, our research plans, and just basically programming and going out into recruit and into the market and running sessions. It's really digesting what is the goal, what are the goals of the research, what are we trying to do, and working with us to make sure that we're screening, asking the right questions, making sure the questions are culturally appropriate, and that number one, we're getting the right participants in, and then two, to make sure that the research is crafted in a way that the participants feel comfortable answering the questions, elaborating, and just having that conversation with us to give us the ultimate insights we need to put a report together. So it's not just here's a partner in this market, they do recruitment and fielding and logistics. We have these strong relationships with the partners who we work with, and we over time build that relationship because they understand how we conduct research, what our expectations are, what pieces of information they need to share with us, when they need to share information with us, and how each piece impacts the timing of the study in terms of when sessions are going to field and when the deliverable is going to be shared with the client team.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. Obviously, thought partnership, very important here. This is not a group or a partner that's simply like, you tell me to do A and I'll do B and I'll get back to you next week about it. It's very different than that, right?
Yeah, they have a big advisory role, like
right.
Know all the nuances, and I know the question about GDPR and privacy and things like that come up all the time, and we use them as our local experts, and they expect to have those discussions with us on every project.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. The partnership is very important, particularly if you're based in the US and you're doing international work. All right, we have time for one more question. I'll field it. The question is, when sampling for surveys in emerging marketplaces, how do I achieve represented population if there are significant slices that are not represented on panels? That's a really good question. I'll just give you a few steps to think through this briefly. If the demographic profile of the subgroup is known, as whatever those may be, you can set quotas to ensure it aligns with the profile. That'd be one thing. If the demographic profile of the subgroup is unknown, which I think really what this question is getting at, is that we'll typically work with a sampling partner to ensure that the ingoing sample, those people who start the survey, are representative of the overall population of the geography that we're in. So they'll just figure out, hey, who's the most common or representative group of people within this particular market. For example, ensuring that age, gender, and other demographics of those who start the survey are aligned with the population of a given country. And from there, because then the ingoing sample is representative, the low incident rate group that falls out should also end up being representative of how that group naturally falls out. So if you sample a group of people in Spain, and this particular group comes at 2% in your survey, you'd anticipate if the survey size is appropriate, then that you're looking at 2% of the people. If a low incidence rate subgroup is part of a larger survey sample, we also take care to ensure that we not report on the data if the sample is too small. Just as another sidebar here about not representation on the panels, the best thing also to do is maybe look at the markets where products are being used and ask specifically for a vetted partner, as Alan suggested, to reach out to those folks. It'll take a little longer and it'll likely be more of an investment, but we've seen some good results just putting in some more time in the timeline, a little more investment, and working with a thought partner to make sure they really understand who we're looking for and who we're looking to access for, say, for instance, a survey. And that brings us at time. So I'm going to hand this back over to Lynette. And I'd like to thank Allison and Sonam for their participation today. As you can see, they're absolutely fantastic people to work with. So really happy to have them on the panel today.
Thank you all for joining today. Thank you to our panelists for an awesome conversation. As noted here on the screen, please keep an eye on your inbox. We will be sending you over the webinar recording to watch at your leisure, and some additional resources, including some articles about international research for further reading. And that about wraps it up for today. If you want to learn a little bit more about international research, we've got a lot of content on our website, and you can also reach out to our panelists from today by email. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.